Today, I wanted to start off talking about the spice of lifer, which is someone who struggles with disorganized attachment. And that is because it is probably the least most specifically addressed in the attachment literature. And I will tell you that's primarily because when you're talking about disorganized attachment, you're really talking about trauma. You're talking about trauma response. You may be talking about a form of reactive attachment. So the search terms you are using are probably going to look a little bit differently. But let's talk about it in the context of disorganized attachment. So if you are someone who deeply yearns for love, but you tend to feel kind of desperately fearful of it, of being abandoned or rejected eventually, or that you're not somehow deserving of it. And so as a result, you tend to kind of sabotage your relationships, or your feelings tend to go from hot to cold very quickly before a budding relationship can even get up off the ground. Then it's likely that you are someone that is struggling with disorganized attachment. Now, oftentimes disorganized attachment is referred to as fearful avoidance. You might also sometimes hear it referred to as anxious ambivalent, but it's more likely to be referred to as fearful avoidance or disorganized attachment. And it's a result of what's called unresolved parenting. So that means that the parents had a degree, or were not resolved within themselves around some kind of trauma that they experienced. Okay. So the children end up appearing to be kind of disorganized. Their behaviors are unpredictable. They tend to become parentified children. Either they're very strict with their parents in a way, or they kind of spin off into these sort of unpredictable behaviors. All right. These are the longitudinal studies that Mary Main did when she looked at children that had disorganized attachment. I refer to individuals with disorganized attachment as spice of lifers. Why do I do that? Well, because the word disorganized is so critical and judgy, right? It's very predictive of a negative outcome, but it tends to discount all of the wonderful, beautiful things that result of having this kind of contrast in your life experience. I actually believe that the greater your conflict, the greater your calling, okay? And so, what I would like to do today is offer perhaps a more hopeful and compassionate exploration of three strengths of the spice of lifer. And in talking about the three strengths, we will talk about how sometimes these things can get them into trouble in relationships. But I think it's important to approach these things from a strength-based attitude. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the spice of lifer in partnership. So the spice of lifer, if you are a spice of lifer, you're probably capable of great empathy and emotional depths. But at the same time, you might also be overwhelmed by that. And so this overwhelmment kind of makes it difficult to sort through and really comfortably organize your feelings and your inner states. And so as a result, you might be a little bit of sick of people saying things like, oh, you're too intense. Okay. And it leaves you feeling lonely and isolated. You don't want to burden other people with your problems, but you're also probably in kind of a desperate need of connection. And you feel that very keenly. And so sometimes that leaves you feeling a bit confused about what your needs actually are. And if you are just somehow slipping into someone else's needs, the boundaries are very confused there. And, at the same time, because there's such a sense of boundary confusion, the safest thing to do is to slip back into the most basic, simplest form of thinking about things. And that is black and white thinking, right? Yes or no, in or out, okay? Right or wrong. And so this tendency to have black and white thinking may lead you to become kind of polarizing, okay? Because it produces a powerful critic, right? There's no gray areas there. So as a result, you may tend to be kind of a polarizing personality, kind of a provocateur in a social situation, even if you don't mean to be. So for example, like a Rolling Stone, who is someone who has an avoidant attachment style, you could be a great defender of the underdog and of those that you feel are essentially good and loving. Or you might admire like an anti-hero, for example, who is a criminal, but they have a heart of gold. Either way, you tend to be a really fierce adversary to those that you feel are bad and undeserving, and you really do not spare the rod in punishing them. And so it can be really hard, even if you are that villain, right? You punish yourself just as hard. And so it can be really hard for individuals to sort of live up to this kind of unambiguous standard of perfection. And so you might find yourself feeling left out of group or social situations. So there's a hungry desire to belong and to feel seen, but never quite feeling as if that is satisfied, never quite feeling as if you fit in anywhere. And it's important to realize that this hard line and critical voice that you carry, you probably often turn in on yourself. And that makes it really hard for you to see and accept the gray areas in others because you are so hard on yourself. And so romantic relationships, they tend to offer a sense of solace and excitement. And when you feel in sync with your partner, it's like the lights have finally turned on and love kind of swallows you up and you're sort of at one with everything. And you're really wildly creative in the way that you express your feelings, and your partners can be really smitten with stars in their eyes at first. And unfortunately, often it only lasts so long, because after that initial infatuation phase, the shine starts to wear off and the unavoidable sort of boring routines of life tend to step in, and they demand your partner's attention be divided eventually, and your attentions be divided eventually. And so this might send you reeling, and you start to question the foundations of the entire relationship. And so as the intimacy deepens, which is getting into the routines of life and not needing the highs and the lows so much, right? Your partner might be able to ride that and not think that it's something's wrong. They just think that's the natural progression of things, whereas you start to think something's wrong, okay? And so as intimacy deepens, the reality kind of reveals itself to maybe be less romantic or dazzling than you'd originally experienced. And so then you start to distrust and doubt your partner's affections. Jealousy might take over, and distrust, and you find yourself sneaking into their phone or obsessively checking their social media for signs of infidelity. Or you start to get bored, and then you wonder, what was the fuss all about? Suddenly your feelings have switched from hot to cold. And then your partner becomes kind of increasingly confused and frustrated by your moodiness. And they don't understand why you can't trust them. And so maybe they say things that they don't mean in anger because they're accusing you of being too intense, right? Too much. And maybe they actually do some of the things that you are accusing them of doing just to spite you. And then that only confirms your suspicion that they are flawed. And then you break up, only to feel that sense of achy yearning again, right? Maybe it's only even days later and suddenly you regret your decision. And so typically when you find yourself caught in that kind of spin cycle, there are 5 ways that a spice of lifer copes with those struggles. Now, there are 10 ways. I refer to them as deactivating and activating strategies. For disorganized individuals, they tend, because they have both almost, they have higher levels of both anxiety and avoidance, which is they have a high degree of ambivalence, right? High avoidance, high anxiety means a lot of conflict and ambivalence, okay? They can swing back and forth between both activating and deactivating strategies. But one thing I will say, for all of those put together, there are 5 ways that the spice of lifer is coping with this. And you may see this manifest in an anxious person as well as a more avoidant person. But the spice of lifer will really encompass these, and it might manifest through activating and deactivating strategies. So basically what I'm outlining here for you are 5 spectrums. And you can imagine the spice of lifer sort of floats kind of fast cycles between 2 ends of these spectrums. And the first is black and white thinking. The second is omnipotent notions. So when I'm talking about omnipotent notions, it's this idea that you somehow have control over someone else's thoughts, feelings, or progression, right? So they tend to assume more authority than they actually have. They kind of fancy themselves a bit like mind readers. I know I'm really good at manipulating people because I'm so empathic, but sometimes they have an inflated sense of this to the point where they kind of think they're wizards. And so they make predictions about a partner's thoughts, feelings, or verbalizations and imagine what their reactions might be before they ever step into conversation with them, because they don't actually want that conversation to be an open loop. They want it to be a closed loop. And so they go through there are considerable strengths in order to determine what the outcome is going to be before they even step into it. But if, let's say, things go wrong, then they take too much responsibility for that because they think they should have been able to control it, or they don't accept any culpability at all. Okay, so that's what I mean by omnipotent notions. The other piece is narrative discrepancies. So sometimes people refer to this as like gaslighting or something like that. That's really more, gaslighting does exist, but that's really more where there's a malicious intent. Okay. Sometimes spice of lifers, because they have a disorganized attachment style, come from a more abusive, neglect, traumatic kind of background. The messages that were communicated in their upbringing were very confusing. So as a result, they may have some selective memory. There may be some idealization, minimization, and dismissiveness that's going on that creates discrepancies in their stories. So you might say, well, don't you remember this? And they'll be like, I would never say such a thing. And you think, oh my God, they're gaslighting me. But it may be that they truly do not remember it that way because it's an unconscious defense mechanism. Okay, so narrative discrepancies. Number 4 is overgeneralizations. Okay, so that's kind of like where you come to sort of an erroneous conclusion. So when one trait, thought, or action or perception kind of gets overgeneralized to sort of prove your negative beliefs or expectations about yourself or the possibilities for love. And it kind of overlaps with black and white thinking. So for example, you like watching Netflix on Saturday nights? Well, I like going to the club. That's it. This is never going to work, right? Or I had a relationship once, but I messed it up by being reckless. I'll never have a relationship like that again. Or my partner doesn't like cooking. Well, now they're going to dump me and go and find someone else who's better at this than I am, right? Or once a cheater, always a cheater. My grandmother used to say, women mourn, men replace, right? Overgeneralizations. The last one is vilification. So when a spice of lifer feels stressed, particularly around a romantic conflict, they have a tendency to kind of exhibit a little bit of a paranoid or defensive position. And so as a result, they vilify their partners. So they sometimes, whether this is conscious or unconscious, presume that at the basis of every partnership, there's a power struggle and an unspoken jockeying for emotional control in the relationship. So in times of distress, they assume that their partner has a malicious intent towards them, that their partner is trying to exert power or control over them. And so they just suit up, they armor up for battle. And sometimes they even create these conflictual scenarios if they have experienced power struggles in game playing as the only way to actually be connected to the people that they are attached to. Okay, so they may need to create those scenarios in order to feel connected. So this sounds kind of like, he's just doing that to piss me off. It's so obvious. She just wants to control me and turn me into her little puppet. He just wants to humiliate me for his own gratification and laugh about it with his friends. Oh no, they're not going to get the better of me. I'm going to get them. I'm going to get the better of them and make them regret this. So vilification, particularly in conflict. The other thing I want to talk about primarily here is strengths. So that's sort of how they might manifest in terms of in a conflictual situation, how some of those struggles might pop up in the context of relationship. But for today, I really wanted to focus on the strengths. So there are 3 major strengths of the spice of lifer that I want to highlight here. And the first one is that they can be passionately expressive. So as a spice of lifer, if you are a spice of lifer, you may have a depth of emotion and passion that is hard to contain. And so creativity is something that may appeal to you, even if you wouldn't describe yourself as artistic. So you might really get poetry. You really feel the music. You can get lost in a painting or a book or a movie, and you can understand the layers of meaning that may fly over everybody else's head. You may also be drawn to acting or other expressive forms of art, like dance movement, for example, and you have an ability to really lose yourself in sex if you want to. And this gives you also a capability for being and a really a taste for the sweetness of life, the spiciness of life. And that's really why I refer to these individuals as spice of lifers, because they can tap into that in the way that a lot of other people miss out on. When we have a strength, unless we are able to moderate it with flexible personal boundaries, oftentimes if we experience a strength within ourselves, we overexert it to the point where it steps into the shadow aspect of that. So, for example, the shadow aspect of being very emotionally and passionately expressive is that sometimes passionate feelings can be so big and so overwhelming that the experience itself kind of loses its form altogether. So when that happens, it becomes hard to distinguish one emotion from another or stimulation from response. And it can lead to a sense of numbing out or feeling nothing at all. Like if you squirt a drop of red food coloring in a bowl of water, right? That coloring expands and it becomes diffuse, more so and more so and more so and more so, until, depending on how big that bowl is, you can't even determine if there was any color at all in there. So this kind of expressiveness and expansiveness may be something that you demonstrate on a regular basis, or it may just be an aspect of yourself that kind of worries you, that you might feel too vulnerable at times, or you might slip into getting kind of locked down with your emotions and you sort of numb out. You go from being highly emotionally stimulated and expressive to all of a sudden you're just like numbed out and you don't have any feelings at all. And that's that hot to cold, because you're either highly concentrated or you're way too diffuse. And that can create an internal anxiety and a sense of pressure as well. Now, the second strength is they are highly charismatic. Now, spice of lifers are extremely perceptive, most likely because they have spent a large portion of their lives to varying degrees of hypervigilance. And so they're a bit of a paradox in that they can accurately sense the emotions of other people, even if it's difficult to discern their own feelings and internal states. So as a result, they can read a room like nobody's business. And so for some spice of lifers, they apply that talent towards crafting this highly charismatic persona that they have. And of course, charisma, that's an asset in almost every endeavor that you might want to pursue. The shadow side of that, of course, is it can be twofold. And first is, if a spice of lifer wears that charismatic mask for too long, then they're unable to trust the affections and the attention of the people that they have attracted. And so they can't really know, do they love me for the mask or do they love me for me? And you know what? I'm not really sure what the difference is anyway. Okay. And so secondly, the superpower can also frighten the spice of lifer, because then they might start to compulsively wield it over others, manipulating them to get what they want. Now, on the one hand, they could feel terribly guilty and shameful about that afterwards. But on the other hand, perhaps they don't feel so guilty or shameful about it. In fact, they might discover that they don't feel much of anything. And that numbness can be even scarier, because that creates a sense of derealization, kind of like nothing in life is truly real, and so nothing in life really matters. And so if a person gets stuck there, it can lead to forms of sociopathy or psychopathy. And to protect themselves from slipping down that hole, then they rigidly hang on to and seek out what are basic but highly stimulating emotions, like excitement, arousal, fear, desperation, anger, resentment, even violence and aggression. And they repeatedly create scenarios that yield those feelings in relationships and or in their partners. The third strength is a potential for deep compassion. Now, while a spice of lifer's powers of perception can be used to create a charismatic persona and potentially manipulate people towards their own ends, it also grants them this incredible potential to experience deep compassion for another person and for all living beings, especially, for example, plants and animals. I have met many a spice of lifer that feels the most at home in nature and or surrounded by pets and animals. So, for example, I once met a man who left home when he was 17, and as a middle child, he was just tired of being compared to his older brother, hated being forced to work on a farm since the age of 6, and couldn't tolerate his father's oppressive hostility anymore. So he joined the military, wound up in special forces, and experienced some trauma around that time of his life. After he left the military, taught himself a second language, became an arborist, which is someone who works with trees, climbs, cuts down trees, works on clearing forest areas, things like that. And he chose that profession at the time because he was afraid of heights and he wanted to conquer that fear, which he did. And so when asked about his romantic history as a heterosexual man, he was mostly reticent, except to say that his hotel heart grumbled when he thought about women. He said they would visit, but they wouldn't stay. And although it wasn't really clear to me from the way he expressed himself whether that was because they chose not to stay or whether it was because his feelings faded or both, his response was, well, what's the difference? Anyway, they're not here now, so it must not have been real love. And so at the time that I interviewed him, he was around 40 years of age, and he had quit being an arborist. And it pained him now to think of how many trees he had cut down in his youth because he had come to think of them as having their own spirit. And now he was a driver. And he would, anytime he would see a tree, he would touch it and he would bless it with his hand for all the times he'd cut one down. And now as a driver, he would often see animals getting hit, on the side of the road. Roadkill would break his heart. And one time he saw a dog that had just recently gotten hit, stopped the car, got out of the car, dragged the dog into the woods to say a prayer and allow the dog to die with dignity. The point here is that you can have these tremendously difficult experiences in your life, and it can give you a level of compassion, a potential for deep, 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 deep compassion. Okay. And sometimes we can see this manifest through the ways in which we relate to nature, okay, as opposed to other people. Now, the shadow side of this form of compassion, of course, is that unfortunately, sometimes for a spice of lifer, if they become overly identified with animals or pets, and sometimes children, the aspects that more helpless creatures, and they project into or onto that helpless creature, be it an animal or a child, all the weak and helpless parts of themselves that they now detest and reject because it was detested and rejected by their early attachment figures. If there is a particularly punitive parent that has been internalized, and now they turn that in on themselves, they may project it onto helpless creatures and or children around them. And that's when we start to see the transmission of intergenerational abuse. That can happen. And remember, disorganized attachment is the result of unresolved trauma. And there may be many circumstances in which that is because there has been some unresolved issues of abuse in a family system. When we're talking about attachment styles, it's important to realize that these are all on a spectrum. So if you've been watching me for a while, you know that I actually think anxiety and avoidance are actually two sides of the same coin. So what we're talking about really is degrees of ambivalence. So ambivalence is when you feel high levels of anxiety and high levels of avoidance. Now, if you have a spice of life or attachment style, you have high ambivalence, which means you have a lot of conflict. So you might find yourself 1 minute feeling like, yeah, I'm obsessed with this person. I'm all in. I really want to be in this relationship. I'm totally preoccupied with them and what they're doing. And that might be what we might qualify as a more open-hearted way of being, kind of an anxious way of being. And then it's almost like you flood yourself with that. And then all of a sudden, like, they respond to you, they're responsive, they want to be connected with you in that way. And then all of a sudden you're like out of nowhere, your feelings switch and you're like, oh, really? What's wrong with you that you would be that attracted to me? You're boring. You're not that much of a challenge. I don't even really understand why I was all that into you. Like, this is your inner monologue. You might not be that outwardly expressive with it, but you might do things to sabotage the relationship and try to get them to think it was their idea to break up with you when you'd kind of already reached that place, right? And then later, and then they do. They give you an ultimatum, and you're like, well, I'm breaking up with you because you're giving me this ultimatum. Meanwhile, you kind of backed them into a corner so that they had to do that. And then they break up with you, and and then they find someone else to start dating, and all of a sudden your pride is wounded, and suddenly they start looking good to you again, and you're just like, oh, I want to get that person back. But really it's more about power dynamics, and it's kind of like, and then when we become preoccupied with power dynamics, it's because we only understand connection in that way. And when someone responds to you and you suddenly shut down, like your feelings disappear, it's because there's such a deep sense of threat that that it's unsafe to be in a reciprocal relationship. Okay, it's much safer to be in the power dynamic drama cycle drama game, and that's exciting. So if you're someone who's more of a spice of lifer, then it's not just that like you're anxious, but you're afraid of getting rejected. So sometimes you kind of suppress it a little bit and you try not to act anxious. And so maybe you withdraw, and you're saying that the withdrawal is kind of an avoidant behavior. So you're wondering if you're struggling with avoidance. That's still anxiety. That's still just behaving anxiously. It's just a punitive withdrawal. But if you internally, viscerally feel like shuts off, 1 minute you're obsessive, the next minute could give a shit, that's more spice of lifer. Really what you are attracting to one another is the dimensions within you. So when you have someone who's dismissive avoidant, what they are drawn to in someone who has more anxiety. So if you're saying they're fearful avoidant is another term that could be equated with disorganized attachment. But someone who's fearful avoidant may have more sort of outwardly displayed anxious symptoms. And so that person, when you have, so the person who is dismissive, they are drawn to someone who's more expressive. They're drawn to someone usually who's kind of sparky. They're drawn to someone who can hold and express all the aspects of themselves that they have dismissed for whatever reason. Because when they are with that person can hold those aspects. That person, they can kind of vicariously experience those aspects of themselves through that person. And because it is through that person, they can give themselves permission to have it. But the paradox is that because they have dismissed it within themselves for so long, as they start to become closer to this other person that they've given permission to express them, and they've given themselves to permission to express it through them, they will start to eventually dismiss them too. They will start to eventually dismiss it and dismiss them too. They dismiss it in themselves, they will dismiss it in them too. And they will be annoyed by it in the same way that they might be annoyed by it within themselves. It's the same mechanism. It's like, I cannot allow it within myself. Our partners give us permission to allow it in them up until a certain point. But the closer you get, the more we start to self-identify with their partners. We stop seeing our partners as someone who's separate from us. We start getting comfortable. We start dropping our boundaries. And now we start to think of our partners as just an extension of ourselves, right? This is what I mean by sometimes we sort of do this form of self-abandonment. So we start thinking of our partners as extensions of ourselves. And then we start projecting onto them the same critical voice that we zap ourselves with. So now we start dismissing our partners as much as we dismiss things within ourselves. And our partners aren't going to take it in the same way that you accept it within yourself, and that creates conflict in the relationship. But I actually believe that all open-hearted individuals, anxious individuals, are equally as avoidant, because they often chase partners that they know aren't going to give them what they want. Because they think and they believe, if I can just get that curmudgeon to love me, then I will have proved to myself and everyone else that I am worthy of love. But the backside of that is they don't think they're worthy of love. So they keep chasing someone who's going to keep reinforcing that belief, because that's arousing to them, because it reminds them of those original pathways that were carved in childhood when they grew up with conditions of love. You had to earn it, right? If you didn't earn it, then it's not exciting. And so it's the same spectrum. It's the same spectrum and dimension. So even if you have a partner who, for whatever reason, you're not able to make it work, right? You're not able to make it work with them. And you see so much potential in them, and they're not able to meet you where you're at. And if they never do, there are people their whole lives who what I call remain in the wandering phase of romantic partnerships. I think there's 4 phases of romantic relationship, and it's the wandering, exploring, discovering, and loving. And the wandering is when you're kind of responding to stimulus and you don't really think about why you feel the way you do. You're just preoccupied with the fact that you feel it, and you need to express it, and you need to kind of like bounce off things sort of aimlessly in your environment. And you also have a tendency to think, well, I don't know what I really want in partnership, but I'll know it when I see it. So you tend to just welcome everything and anything into your sphere, right? There's not a lot of discernment going on. As a result, lessons learned in the wandering phase are pretty painful, because you tend to live them over and over and over again. And some people will remain in that place their whole lives. They really will, because we spend a lot of time with our energy just in our heads. Even if they learn about why it is that they're doing the things that they do, they may never lift a finger to change it. And here's the thing, you can't get caught up in that story for somebody else, because it may be that that's them fulfilling their potential. Their job may be simply to rattle you enough that you bloom. Who knows? You cannot preoccupy yourself by forcing someone else into a state of awareness or consciousness that may not be their reason for being here on earth. In fact, their fullest potential may be just to serve that purpose. You can't know that. That's beyond your capacity to know.